Okay, so my name is Amy Vennos. I'm a sophomore mathematics major here at SU, and this lecture recital is based on a music creative project that I did with the Honors College with my faculty advisor, Dr. Leanna Wood. And it's about the Russian sound with a focus on piano repertoire. So my goal at the beginning of this semester was to create a definition of Russian music. But as I continued with researching, I realized that this definition was going to be a little bit more complicated than I had originally thought. And I'll give you a hint. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when I say the words Russian music? What sort of words do you think of? And you can just shout them out.
Marching.
Marching, okay, yeah. Anyone else?
Dark.
Dark, okay. Yeah, so very vast or controlling music. But have any of you thought about delicate? If you ever watched Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, there's a Sugar Plum Fairy song. And that's not very dark or powerful, it's very delicate. So I realized that my understanding of Russian music was a little bit too narrow to understand all the variety of different sounds that Russian music can take. So I had to learn a little bit of music history to find out exactly what Russian music was. So the first song on the program is by Alexander Borodin. It's the Polopsian dances, the Dance of the Maidens, and this dance opens up Act 2 of Prince Igor's ballet, of Borodin's ballet, Prince Igor. And it's internationally famous. If you ever heard of Stranger in Paradise, it is a song in the ballet or the musical Kismet. And it might sound really familiar to you because this melody is similar to the Polopsian dances. But these pieces are actually famously Russian. They actually opened up the Sochi Olympics in 2014, and they are famously known as Russian pieces in particular. So let's time travel to before Borodin, and we're going to learn a little bit about Westernization. So Russia at this time was going through this concept called Westernization. And what this was is that Western countries were changing while Russia was not. And Russia realizes that these Western countries are changing, and then they realize that they have to get up on the level of the Western countries. Now, how were they changing? The Western countries were going through this concept called nationalism. And nationalism is a concept where Western countries are starting to write their own histories and create art and music that represents themselves to define their own country. And Russia realizes that they have to get on board with this nationalistic trend. Now, Tsar Nicholas I actually created or started the creation of these musical conservatories, especially throughout Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this was an academic approach to learning music. Now, Alexander Borodin never actually went to a musical conservatory, and he actually really opposed the concept of learning music academically. Alexander Borodin, along with the Mighty Five, or the Mighty Handful, which consisted of him, Modest Mussorgsky, Balakirev, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Cesar Coe, they really did oppose the concept of a musical conservatory. And because of this, they underwent a lot of criticism. Because of this criticism, I feel like these composers had to create different nationalistic themes to create a nationalistic sound, to get rid of that criticism. And because of this, they have a lot of folk music and Russian folk themes in their music. Prince Igor is a very good description of this. It's a good example. And Prince Igor is about this historical figure, Prince Igor, who's the hero, and he is defending his country from the barbaric nomadic tribe called the Polopsi. And they're from Central Asia. Now, Prince Igor is very similar to this conflict going on between Russia and England during the time. And this was called the Great Game. So during the Great Game, Russia and England are having this imperialist conflict around this Central Asian country, which sort of corresponds to the Polopsi tribe. And this sort of makes sense because he's trying to appeal to the Russian people in order to make his music more widespread and accepted by the Russian people. Now, Prince Igor actually uses Orientalism. And what I mean by this is that the Pelovskian dances are exaggerating the exoticism of the Pelovsky tribe in order to make them seem more uncivilized and barbaric. And what this does is it lifts up Russia to make them seem more civilized. And that also makes sense because the Western countries were sort of putting down Russia at the time. So the fact that Russia was creating this barbaric notion of the Pelovsky people lifts up the Russian people. So to conclude, even though this piece was not really intended to sound Russian and it was supposed to create an image of the Pelovsky people, this nationalistic theme makes this music sound very Russian and nationalistic. So let's get on to the music. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Wood, who is my faculty advisor. piece on the program is by Tchaikovsky, and he is probably the most famous composer on this program to the Western people. Raise your hand if you ever listened to or seen Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. Yeah, all of you, right? I'm not surprised. But what is surprising is that Tchaikovsky is not very well renowned in Russia. Before college, I listened to and watched most of the international Tchaikovsky competition, and it's really great, you should check it out. But what's strange is that the website of this competition really focuses on the prestige of the performers and not really the influence Tchaikovsky has on Russian music. So I thought it was strange, so I looked back into Tchaikovsky's background. So Tchaikovsky was actually a lawyer in the beginning of his life, and he didn't really get into music until about 21, where he decided to go to the St. Petersburg Conservatory and start really focusing on music. And he actually lived around the time of the Mighty Handful. But the thing is, he wasn't really as interested in nationalism as the Mighty Handful. But he still needed to support himself financially, so he agreed to write Les Saisons, which is this piece, or it's a set of pieces which represent each month of the year. I'm going to be playing November, which is Troika, which represents November. Now, Troika is a very Russian name. It represents a sleigh held by 3 horses, and there's actually a picture of it in your program notes, if you'd like to look. And this is a very rare example of Tchaikovsky's use of nationalism. But he had to write in this style because this piece, these set of pieces were created to be read by a Russian audience. So what Tchaikovsky had to do was change his style to appeal to this Russian audience. So Tchaikovsky's works are considered Russian in the fact that the Western people consider his works Russian, but only this set of works is truly intended for a Russian audience. Now, before I play Tchaikovsky's Troika, I'm going to talk a little bit about Scriabin. So Alexander Scriabin was a piano prodigy. He had a very military background. His father was in the military, so he joined the 2nd Moscow Army Cadet Corps and for his education in the beginning. But he realized that he loved music so much, so he decided to extend his influence on music and go to conservatory training. Now, Scriabin had a little obsession. He was obsessed with Frédéric Chopin. And Frédéric Chopin is this Polish composer who grew up in France. Now, he loved Chopin so much that he would sleep with Chopin's works underneath his pillow. I thought that was hilarious. And I was kind of wondering, why would he love Chopin so much? And it really wasn't that weird to like Chopin during his time, because a lot of the people in the musical community around Scriabin esteemed Chopin's works. His music instructors definitely pushed Chopin's works to be played, and also his friends, his friend Rachmaninoff, who is also a famous Russian composer, really loved Chopin's works. So I did some digging to see why these people would really look into Chopin's work instead of anyone else's. And the answer is nationalism. Chopin created a lot of mazurkas and polonaises, which are a type of Russian folk music. And the Russian musical community around Scriabin quite possibly interpreted these works as being very nationalistic. And because the Russian musical community at this time really liked nationalism, they thought that Chopin was a nationalistic composer. Now, there is some debate to whether Chopin is an actual nationalistic composer or not, but the Russian people definitely interpreted this as a nationalistic composer. Now, the 24 Preludes is a great example of this. These preludes were not written in order. I'm going to be playing Prelude number 1, which was actually one of the last pieces that he wrote. But these 24 preludes are very similar to Chopin's 24 preludes. I don't have that much of a music theory background, but these pieces are written in the same key, in the same order. So when I'm playing number 1 in C major, Chopin's 24 preludes number 1 is also in C major. There's other musical elements, but I'm not going to go into that because I don't really have that much background in music theory. So after Scriabin finished his conservatory training, he started creating this unique personal style. He actually experimented with extended tonality, which means that if you are playing a chord and you feel like it should be resolved to another chord, he will not resolve it and then play a different chord, so it'll sound really strange. He also had synesthesia, which means he associated colors with the keys of the piano or the tones of the piano, right? And what this did is he started creating this personal unique sound. So he has this symphony called Prometheus. And what this is it's a symphony where the symphony is playing this song, but there's also a lot of colors associated with it. So there's a lot of lights, colored lights that correspond to the tones of the piece. The Prometheus symphony actually created this Prometheus chord, which appears a lot during that symphony. And I'm going to play it for you because it sounds very strange and it sounds a lot different than anything you're going to hear in the next piece. So the Prometheus chord sounds a bit like this. Now that's going to sound a lot different when you listen to the next pieces that I'm going to play. Nevertheless, his early works are not like his new works, but that is because they're influenced by nationalism. So now I'm going to play Troika and Scriabin's Prelude. So the next piece I'm going to play for you is Aaron Khachaturian's Toccata. And the word toccata comes from the word to care, which means to touch. So when you listen to this piece, you're going to hear a very technical part followed by a very broad, passionate part, followed by a very technical part again. Now, Aaron Khachaturian is not originally from Russia. He was actually born in Georgia, and not the one in the US. So what I'm going to do is ask you a very strange question, but I'm not really sure how familiar you guys are with this. I'm going to ask you, do you guys know about Thomas the Tank Engine? Okay, you guys know? Okay. Well, for those of you who don't know what Thomas the Tank Engine is, it's a TV show for little kids to watch. Now, you probably know this, but Aaron Khachaturian did not have Thomas the Tank Engine. But he did have a propaganda train. And this was not an actual train. It was a band of traveling musicians and artists who spread Soviet propaganda to people. Now, this propaganda train came to Khachaturian's homeland, and there was a piano there. So Khachaturian goes and plays the piano, and a crowd gathers around him and they clap. And this really convinced his family to send Khachaturian to Moscow for a visit. Now, Khachaturian, he went with his brother to Moscow, and he was so inspired by the culture and the music there that he decided to stay. He still needed to finish his education, so he joined the biology department of the Moscow University. But he started getting a little bit distracted just because he was interested in music so much. So later, he decides to join the Gniesin School of Music. Now, his instructor, who was Mikhail Gniesin, was a very patriotic person, and he really stressed his students to study very Russian composers. And because of this, Khachaturian was exposed to nationalism at a very young age. Later he goes to Tchaikovsky's classic composition, and that's where he composes the Toccata. Now, even though Khachaturian was very in this kind of community that really stressed nationalism and almost forced it upon a lot of composers, Khachaturian voluntarily accepted nationalism, and he was very open with his beliefs. While studying with Gniesin, he joined this group called Recital, which was a student group who wanted to create nationalistic music. And after graduating at the conservatory, he joined the Union of Soviet Composers. And what this union was, it was a union to put restrictions on Russian music even further. So any music that did not correlate with the Soviet cause would be pushed aside as a study music or an experiment. Later, Khachaturian actually wrote the score to a biography about Lenin. So he was very accepting of nationalism, and he was very open about his beliefs. Later, he created other famously Russian pieces like the Saber Dance, which was Ballet Gayen, and really his use of nationalism makes him Russian. So even though this composer wasn't born in Russia, his acceptance of the Russian nationalism made him a Russian composer. So now I will play for you Khachaturian's Toccata in E-flat. the program, the first of which is Ave Maria by Vladimir Vavilov. First of all, there's not much academic information about this piece. A lot of the information I got, with what I can, is not really academically supported. Actually, one of my sources, if you look in the back, is actually written in Russian, and I had to Google translate it. But I was actually kind of surprised when my piano teacher gave me the score to play in a Russian piano concert. The score of this piece is actually attributing this piece to a Baroque composer, Puccini. And this guy is Italian. So I was confused, why is this piece written by an Italian composer being put in Russian repertoire? The piece is actually written by Vavilov, and it's in this album called Lute Music of the 16th and 17th centuries. And all of those pieces in that album are attributed to these non-Russian Baroque composers. So I was wondering, why would you write music and not credit yourself for the music that you write? And the answer lies in the religious state of Russia at the time. Now, Sovietized Russia was undergoing this phase called scientific atheism, and this was a very hostile environment to any religion out there. The Communist Party would go and burn mosques and execute religious leaders, so it was very dangerous to put out religious music at the time. So what Vavilov did is he ignored any nationalistic trend, and he still wanted to bring out this music to the people of Russia, so he just attributed it to a different composer. So this is sort of like the opposite of Khachaturian. This is a Russian-born composer creating non-Russian music. Now, the next piece, and the last piece, is Doga. It is a piece written by Doga. And it's written for the film My Affectionate and Tender Beast, which came out in 1978. And this piece is very famously Russian. It also accompanied the Fulton dances in the Sochi Olympics. And this composer is not Russian, actually. He was born in Moldova. If you look in your program notes, there's a highlighted Moldova that says it's colored red, but it's actually just shaded. But this composer is not from Russia. My Affectionate and Tender Beast is about this woman who marries this elderly man because he seems to be a little bit wealthy, and she was in poverty. But when she marries him, she realizes that this guy isn't as wealthy as he seemed, so she decides she's kind of stuck. So she goes back and looks back at her past opportunities as this piece plays. So the message of this piece is very nostalgic. And it really appeals to the Russian people, especially now, who were expatriates of the Soviet era when it dissolved in 1991. But this movie is actually internationally famous. And not just the movie, but the piece itself. Ronald Reagan actually visited Moscow, and he said that he enjoyed this piece. And because this movie is about a human conflict, the movie brought out a human element to the Russian people. So the message of this song conveys why it's esteemed by both the Western and Eastern culture. So this piece is very Russian because it has a nationalistic theme, but to the Western people, it's very famous because it tied together the East and the West. So now I will play Ave Maria, followed by Doga's Waltz. born in Russia. Instead, they're linked in this theme called nationalism, and they differ in how they respond to this concept. So I hope you guys take from this recital, and I bet you have a better understanding of what Russian music actually is. So I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming again. I'd like to thank Dr. Wood, my faculty advisor, and I'd like to thank my amazing piano teacher, Luba Paskova. And I'd also like to thank the Honors College for letting this happen and also getting some nice refreshments in the back for you guys to eat later. So before that, I'd like to take this time for you to ask any questions you may have. I'll get to you guys, as many guys as possible, but if you guys have any more questions, I'll be available in the back. Ask any questions. Elena.
What's your interest in Russian culture or Russian music? How did that start?
It started because my piano teacher is from Russia. She has this huge stock of Russian piano music from all these Russian composers. And if you look at the scores, sometimes you can't even tell who wrote it because they're all written in Russian. And I really just like those pieces, so I decided to do some more digging into what Russian music really is.
If you were to do a follow-up recital to expand this, who else would you like to include in your program? Or who might you like to study next that you sort of found out in this process?
I actually would really like to go into Sergei Rachmaninoff. He's one of my favorite composers from Russia. Also Prokofiev, he's really amazing. I love all his music. And maybe some more contemporary music that my piano teacher has stored in a box. So are we good? All right, so I am extremely hungry. So. Okay.